Okay, so the FAA passed a rule for operations over people, and they made a certain statement. So I'm just going to read their statement here for you. So this rule, according to the FAA, this rule amends Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 107, by permitting the routine operation of small UAS at night or over people under certain conditions. This rule is the next step in FAA's incremental approach to integrating UAS into the National Airspace System based on demands for increased operational flexibility and the experience the FAA has gained since it initially published Part 107. This rule also builds on performance-based regulatory philosophy established in Part 107. Okay, so an overview of the final rule. Operations over people. 1. Operations over people. This rule allows expanded routine operation of small unmanned aircraft over people without a waiver or exemption under certain conditions. Prior to this final rule, small UAS operation over people were limited to operation over people who are directly participating in the operation, or they are located under a covered structure or inside a stationary vehicle. This rule expands the ability to conduct operations over people, provided that the operations meet the requirements of one of 4 operational categories. This rule established Subpart D to Part 107, which sets forth the aircraft eligibility and operating requirements for those 4 categories. The first 3 categories of operations over people, which the agency proposed to the national rulemaking process, they are based on the risk of injury they present to people on the ground. It's in response to public comments. This rule also established a 4th category, which is based on the small unmanned aircraft having an airworthiness certificate. The FAA maintains the prohibition on open-air assemblies for Category 3 as proposed. In addition, in response to comments, remote pilots are prohibited from operating a small unmanned aircraft as a Category 1, 2, or 4 operation in sustained flight over open-air assemblies unless the operation meets the requirements of Part 89.110 or 89.115, which are remote identification, both internal and module broadcast requirements for standard remote. To conduct operations involving sustained flight over open-air assemblies for Category 1, 2, and 4, remote pilots must voluntarily comply with the operating broadcast requirements of 89.110 or 89.115 prior to the operational compliance date of the final rule, et cetera, et cetera. Following the operational compliance date for this final rule, all unmanned aircraft are required to register and meet the operating requirements of the remote identification rule, and that's in effect now. It's passed. Either this is my comment, either the manufacturer includes it in the aircraft, or if you have an older aircraft made before 2023, then you would need to have a remote ID module attached to it. Okay, continuing on with the statement from the FAA. Sustained flight over open-air assembly includes hovering above the heads of persons gathered in open-air assembly, flying back and forth over an open-air assembly, or circling above the assembly in such a way that the small UAV remains above some part of the assembly. Sustained flight over open-air assembly of people in Category 1, 2, or 4 operation does not include a brief one-time transit over a portion of the assembled gathering where the transit is merely incidental to point-to-point operation unrelated to the assembly. Okay, so examples, they give examples here described later. The FAA may waive compliance with this provision as appropriate, so you still get waivers. However, conditions of any waiver issued must require or may require the operator to notify law enforcement prior to the operation. Okay, so now they talk specifically about Category 1. Category 1 operations over people are permitted using a small unmanned aircraft that weighs less than 0.55 pounds, including everything that's on board or might be attached to it at the time of takeoff and throughout the duration of the operation. B, does not contain any exposed rotating parts that might lacerate human skins on impact with human beings. But pilots are responsible for determining that their small UAV does not exceed the weight threshold and ensuring that their small unmanned aircraft does not contain those exposed rotating parts that would lacerate skin. So you're responsible, the pilot's responsible, they're saying. Furthermore, no remote pilot in command may operate a small unmanned aircraft as a Category 1 operation in sustained flight over open-air assemblies unless the operation meets the remote identification requirements, which pretty much all modern drones now have. The requirement for Category 1 operation over people are discussed in Section D of the preamble. Okay. Note to the protecting skin from laceration, their note here. They said, as explained, the FAA's decision to ensure protection of skin from lacerating injuries is similar to the logic the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration employs. Federal motor safety vehicle standards give, especially for broken glass, windshields and stuff like that, that's where they get the definition of lacerations, right? Facial lacerations may be minor, but if they're disfiguring, that's sort of the line. Okay, that's Category 1. So simple. We decide what we're going to do. My comments. Category 1, we're the ones, but it's got to be less than 0.55 pounds, so that disqualifies some drones. Now, they recently come out with an adaptation to that where you can get a waiver still, but if you just want to routinely fly over people, in a Category 1 drone, it's got to be less than 0.55 pounds. No rotating parts that might damage it to have remote ID. Okay, Category 2 operations provide performance-based eligibility and operating requirements when conducting operations over people using aircraft that weigh more than 0.55 pounds, but do not have an airworthiness certificate. So if you want, I'll continue. To be eligible for Category 1 operation, small unmanned aircraft must comply with the following 3 safety requirements. First, the aircraft must be designed, produced, or modified such that it will not cause injury to a human being that is equivalent to or greater than the severity of injury caused by a transfer of 11 foot-pounds of kinetic energy upon impact from a rigid object. Small unmanned aircraft will only be eligible to Category 2 operation if the person submitting the declaration of compliance, the applicant, in other words, the manufacturer, can demonstrate that the injury resulting from an impact between that aircraft and a person on the ground is less than this injury severity limit, which again is 11 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. Second, the small unmanned aircraft must not contain any exposed rotating part that could lacerate skin upon impact with a human being, of course. Same thing. Third, small unmanned aircraft may not contain any safety defects, so there must be some kind of process where they can notify the person that buys the drone that if something's come up, like a recall thing. That's how my interpretation anyway. Okay, so point of clarification, according to the FAA here, it says, this rule uses the term applicant to refer to the person who submits a declaration of compliance to the FAA for review and acceptance. An applicant for a declaration of compliance may be anyone who designs, produces, or modifies a small unmanned aircraft. Okay? Typically, we're talking about the manufacturer, but that could be somebody else. All right. Furthermore, the statement continues, a small unmanned aircraft eligible to conduct Category 2 operations must, 1, display a label on the aircraft indicating eligibility to conduct Category 2 operations. 2, have current remote pilot operating instructions that apply to the operation of that specific small UAV aircraft. And 3, be subject to product support and notification. Again, that's recall. The eligibility requirements for Category 2 are further discussed, but I won't read that. The rule also sets forth operating requirements for remote pilots who conduct Category 2 operations. Specifically, the remote pilot must use the UAV that is eligible for Category 2, listed on an FAA-accepted declaration of compliance as eligible for Category 2, and labeled eligible to conduct Category 2. Additionally, no remote pilot in command may operate a small unmanned aircraft as a Category 2 operation in sustained flight over open-air assemblies unless the operation meets the remote identification, operational, and broadcast requirements for standard remote identification unmanned aircraft or an aircraft with a remote identification broadcast module if it was manufactured prior to the compliance date. Okay, so we as pilots, so the manufacturer has to label it, but the person that's going to operate an aircraft, the pilot command is going to operate this category aircraft, Category 2 operation, is going to need to make sure that it has a declaration of compliance, make sure that it's eligible for Category 2, and make sure it's labeled for Category 2. Okay. Category 3. Category 3 is similar to Category 2 You must meet 3 safety requirements. Category 3 operations are subject to a higher injury severity limit than Category 2. Risk of injury to an individual is mitigated by applying operational limitations. To be eligible for Category 3, small unmanned aircraft must comply with these following 3 safety requirements. First, must be designed, produced, or modified such that it will not cause injury to a human being that is equivalent to or greater than the severity of injury caused by a transfer of 25 foot-pounds of kinetic energy upon impact from a rigid object, obviously heavier. Second, small unmanned aircraft must not contain any exposed rotating parts that could lacerate human skin upon impact with a human being. Third, must not contain safety defects, similar to Category 2. They continue. Furthermore, small unmanned aircraft eligible to conduct Category 3 operations must display a label, just like Category 2, on the aircraft, have a current remote pilot operating instructions that apply to the operation of that particular aircraft type, Category 3, and be subject to a product support and notification, recall. The eligibility requirements for Category 3 are discussed further in the document, which I won't read that. Rule sets forth certain operating requirements for remote pilots who conduct Category 3 operations. Specifically, remote pilot must use the aircraft that is, again, our responsibility. If we're going to fly that, need to be sure that the aircraft is indeed Category 3, eligible for Category 3. Make sure it's listed on an FAA accepted declaration of compliance and be labeled to Category 3 operation. Category 3 also includes additional information as well. Category 3 also includes additional operating limitations that are not applicable to Category 2. These operating limitations are necessary to mitigate the increased risk of a heavier aircraft, right? Specifically, Category 3 operations are prohibited over open air assemblies of human beings. All right, so you can't fly over open air assemblies. Unless the operation is within or over a closed or restricted access site, and everyone in that site has been notified that that aircraft may fly over them. So the aircraft may not fly over a sustained flight over a person and not live directly participating in the operation or located under a covered structure, just like before. Sustained flight includes hovering above any person's head, flying, and it also includes flying back and forth over an open air assembly or circling above an uninvolved person in such a way that the aircraft remains above some part of this person. Additionally, a closed or restricted access site could be an area that contains physical barriers, might have policemen around it or personnel around, or both, as appropriate, to ensure that nobody just wanders into this restricted access site. So think a movie set, right? They're going to keep everybody out. So drones can fly over that. Category 3 drone can fly over those. Compliance with the safety requirements, that's mostly up to the manufacturer, but you must, for Category 2 and Category 3, you have to get that declaration of compliance, which means simply that you have to demonstrate to the FAA that it will not present an undue hazard to persons or property on the ground, basically. Let's see, anything we need to add? Okay, Category 4. We'll jump to Category 4. Category 4, the FAA received comments in response to the proposed rulemaking that criticized the agency for insufficiently considering the reliability of unmanned aircraft in determining whether small UAVs could be operated over people. So the FAA says, okay, well, basically, if you can prove that there's enough redundancy, now I'm just giving you comments to condense this long reading. They're saying, basically, we're letting manned aircraft fly over people. How do we do that? We do that because there's redundancy, right? There's more than one motor, perhaps, or more than one generator. So if you can prove to us that there's enough redundancy in the aircraft design that it's not going to fall straight down out of the sky and present an undue hazard to persons or property on the ground, then you can apply for that. The catch to that is that's a really complex process. It's going to take a lot of time. You have to have proving runs. It's going to be, for most manufacturers, it's going to be very expensive to do that. But if we, the first stage of this urban mobility is to have, we falsely call it a drone, but it's a electric vehicle that we're going to fly passengers around. Well, there'll be a pilot in there, so it's not a drone, right? The drone's, but eventually the idea is to make it autonomous, so there's no pilot on there and just passengers. Well, we have to get to that point. If we're going to do that, we need to have an airworthiness certificate. Obviously, the FAA is not going to let us fly people around inside of an aircraft. So anyway, that's Category 4, requires an airworthiness certificate. So for the purpose of the test, that's the main point that if you come across that question, it has Category 4 requires airworthiness certificate, and then there will be no restrictions for flying over people. Just like a small manned aircraft, training aircraft, or the airlines. Obviously, they're not restricted about flying over people. They have restrictions for altitude, but not that. An additional part of the rulemaking process is operations at night, and we've talked about that previously in other documents. So that's a really quick, brief read-through from the FAA statement on that. In class, we'll get more details about specifics, perhaps. And of course, for the written test, you're certainly not going to have to quote all that